September 1939. It's early morning. Pope Pius XII is staring at the phone on his desk. His hands are trembling. The receiver is already clutched in his grasp. On the other end, the voice of Cardinal Luigi Maliagne delivers a sentence that will split the century in two and open the gates to the nightmare of the Second World War.
Your Holiness, Poland is lost.
This is where the real story begins. Riccardo Galeazzi-Lisi, oculist, homeopath, and charmer in Vatican's corridors, managed to win the favor of Eugenio Pacelli, who became Pope Pius XII in 1939. It was the beginning of a dark and enigmatic bond. Around them, the world is catching fire. The new pope finds himself trapped in a nightmare of biblical proportions. Silence or condemnation. Diplomacy or martyrdom. The salvation of the church or that of his soul? And as the Reich spreads like a plague, Pacelli descends beneath St. Peter's Basilica, searching for the tomb of the first apostle, and for a way to stop Adolf Hitler, even to have him killed. At his side is Riccardo, the scientist, the gambler, the adventurer, two men bound by an invisible red thread. A mysterious alliance, never fully understood. Until now. Nazi troops are overrunning Poland, a Catholic nation. Within hours, Hitler's Germany will reduce Warsaw to rubble. Anguish grips Pacelli. He nearly stops eating. His fiercely loyal German housekeeper, Sister Pascalina Lenert, is deeply worried. Just 2 days later, another blow. Italian fascist police arrest Guido Gonella, a journalist at L'Osservatore Romano, the Vatican's official newspaper, for publishing an article against the German invasion of Poland. To secure his release, Pacelli is forced to order the paper to cease public condemnation of the slaughter in Poland. It marks the beginning of a long and painful silence. Adding to the pressure, the French Cardinal Eugene Tisserant, one of the few with the courage to ask openly,
"We must stop this horror!"
Excommunication, the Vatican's atomic weapon. With a single declaration, the Pope can cut anyone off from the community of the faithful. For nearly 1,000 years, to excommunicate a king meant to release his subjects from their oath of loyalty. A strike that made kingdoms collapse from within. To excommunicate Hitler would mean just that. Millions of German Catholics would be forced to choose between the Führer and the life everlasting. Perhaps the only blow that could break the Reich. But Pacelli fears that the tyrants in Rome and Berlin will strike back. He worries about brutal retaliation against Catholics around the world. So, fearing devastating consequences, he refuses. Nonetheless, Pacelli tries a diplomatic path with Hitler. He hopes to rein in the violence. He meets with Hitler's envoys, Ribbentrop and von Hessen. But Hitler does not listen. Instead, he expands the war into Belgium. He crushes the local resistance in a matter of days, with terrifying, almost satanic efficiency. When L'Osservatore Romano tries to publish letters from Pius XII expressing solidarity with King Leopold III of Belgium, Mussolini steps in and censors the content. Copies of the newspaper are burned in public. Newsstand vendors are beaten by fascist thugs. Pacelli realizes two things. Mussolini, terrified of Hitler, is now ready to go after anyone, even the Pope. And nothing, absolutely nothing, seems capable of stopping the overwhelming advance of the Nazi-fascists. Before Eugenio Pacelli, one figure rises like a beacon. John the Baptist, the cousin of Jesus, almost an older brother, his forerunner, one of the most powerful and magnetic voices in the Gospels. He, too, once stood face to face with raw power, tyrant of flesh and blood, Herod Antipas, and he didn't back down. He shouted the truth, threw it in the despot's face, even though he knew it would cost him his life. He was arrested. He was beheaded. And now the question looms. Should Pius XII do the same? Proclaim to the world the truth of God? Excommunicate Hitler, Mussolini, Hirohito? Call on every Christian to rise up, even knowing it might send millions of innocents to prison or to their graves? Like John the Baptist, he too might lose his head. But his head is the church itself. But the gospel also offers another model, one that's radically different. The silent figure, the absent one. Saint Joseph, the earthly father of Jesus. A righteous man, the scriptures say, but silent. The scriptures record not a single word from him, not a speech, not a sentence, not even a whisper. When Jesus was arrested, mocked, tortured, nailed to a cross, Joseph was nowhere to be found. He did not defend him. He did not comfort Mary. He simply never appeared. It was as if he had vanished, or as if his absence was his final act of love. To protect, even in silence, even through disappearance. Was that not also a worthy example? To remain silent, to endure, to let the mystery unfold, even at the cost of appearing like a coward or a deserter. In the end, to save the church, Pacelli chooses a third path. Not John the Baptist's, not Joseph's either. Something in between, a narrow path, ambiguous, slippery. In public, he aligns himself with Axis propaganda. He forces Catholic newspapers to obey. When, on June 10, 1940, Italy enters the war, the Holy See does not object. On the contrary, it calls for divine protection for the fascist armies. Behind closed doors, Eugenio relies on the skills he has honed over a lifetime, the quiet power of diplomacy. He believes he can stop the horrors of war through political maneuvering and careful negotiation. To him, compromise is a moral duty. It's woven into his vocation. He wants to influence events from behind the scenes, without grand gestures or reckless decisions, trusting in the calm authority that comes with the papal office. Meanwhile, whispers from the east begin to reach him. Deportations, concentration camps, extermination camps. Pacelli becomes even more certain. He cannot become the John the Baptist of his time. He cannot sacrifice the head of the entire church on the altar of truth. He cannot lead millions of Catholics into persecution. If God had wanted a new John the Baptist, he would not have allowed him to become pope. Better to follow Joseph's example. Remain silent. Disappear. There's always one man watching him closely. Just as silent, just as steady. Dr. Riccardo Galeazzi-Lisi. Between poker nights and a growing stack of business cards, Riccardo does what he's always done. Treats, listens, waits. With Pacelli now Pope, the calls from the Vatican multiply. Colds, insomnia, gastritis, the strain of power. He becomes the quiet guardian of Pius XII, as Hitler and Mussolini redraw the map of Europe with lines drawn in blood. An unassuming shadow in a white coat, playing the ultimate hand of his life, every chip pushed to the center of the table. But deep inside the Vatican, far from the lights and the war-consuming Europe, and well away from Riccardo's poker tables, Pope Pius XII is planning a secret operation. A sweeping effort combining faith, archaeology, and power politics. Beneath St. Peter's Basilica, a small group of men drive the first pickaxe into consecrated ground. They're following direct orders from Pope Pius XII. This isn't a restoration, nor is it merely an archaeological excavation. It's an extraordinarily ambitious mission. To find and unearth St. Peter, the first apostle, the very foundation of the Church. Because behind this effort lies a troubling question, one with deep political consequences. German Protestant historians, like Karl Hussey, have started saying it out loud.
St. Peter was never in Rome during his lifetime.
If Peter, the first apostle, the first pope, never preached in Rome, if he didn't die at Nero's hands in this city, then the Roman Church and the papacy that has ruled it for centuries would be built on a lie. The Pope's authority, the entire structure of the Church, reduced to myth. In that light, the Vatican becomes a stronghold of impostors, a place without true authority. Its moral power, paper thin. It could be toppled, conquered. For Pacelli, refuting these claims by revealing St. Peter's body to the world, right here in Rome, beneath St. Peter's Basilica, is an absolute priority, a matter of survival for the Roman Church itself. But the bones of the apostles have always been considered untouchable. Even approaching them is seen as dangerous, even sacrilegious. In a letter to Empress Constantina of Byzantium, St. Gregory the Great warned that disturbing the tombs of Peter, Paul, or Lawrence would bring unspeakable punishment. Not symbolic ones, real ones, misfortune, swift and unforgiving. And it's not just legend. In 1626, when Pope Urban VIII ordered the construction of the canopy over St. Peter's altar, the work required digging right where the apostles' tomb was believed to lie. The laborers fell ill. Accidents happened. Some even died. A string of disasters, unexplained, yet eerily precise. As if the place were defending itself. For centuries, one belief has endured. Touching those bones is strictly forbidden. Even dwelling on the idea could bring consequences. For this highly dangerous undertaking, Pope Pius XII appoints his friend, Monsignor Ludwig Kaas, to oversee the excavations. But who was Ludwig Kaas? A tragic figure, one of the most tragic of his time.
Ludwig
Kaas was a prelate of the Diocese of Trier, an expert in canon law who played an important political role in the German Catholic Party known as the Zentrum, or Centre.
I spoke with Professor Gustavo Corni, one of Italy's foremost scholars of the Weimar Republic, the fragile democracy that governed Germany before Hitler's rise.
And Kaas played an important role starting in 1928, when he was elected political secretary of the party, a position he would hold until the spring or summer of 1933, when he became both the subject and the protagonist of important political negotiations within the Berlin Parliament.
Important political negotiations. In truth, it was Ludwig Kaas himself who secured the Catholic Zentrum Party's support for Hitler, paving the way for the Führer's rise to power. The same Kaas, now hidden behind Vatican walls, digs with trembling hands in search of Peter's bones. But perhaps what he's truly seeking isn't relics, but redemption. March 24th, 1933. Berlin. The Reichstag, Germany's parliament, burned down. Someone deliberately set it ablaze, a fire that raged until the parliament was left in ruins. A spectacular act of terror. No one knows for sure who did it. But Adolf Hitler, newly appointed Chancellor of Germany, has no doubts. He blames the communists. There's no evidence. If anything, it's far more likely his own men lit the match. But for Hitler, the verdict is already in. This is just the beginning. A revolution is coming, he warns, and the only answer is an iron fist. He needs a majority to pass an extraordinary law. The Enabling Act, a law that would hand him absolute control of Germany. But he doesn't have the votes, and he needs the support of the Zentrum, the Catholic Party. 73 deputies. They hold the balance. Leading that delegation is a priest with round glasses and the air of a stern professor, Ludwig Kaas. In that moment, history trembles. A single no can stop the law that makes the dictatorship possible. But the Zentrum votes yes.
So the Zentrum played a crucial role in the political history of Weimar and was essentially a party that supported the Republic, loyal to its institutions, in some respects a defender of republican institutions. Kaas represented a moderate spirit, essentially a conservative one. He was a moderate, a man of order, as we might say. Someone inclined to accept, to embrace the position of Hitler as a chancellor for all, a figure of national unity at a very difficult moment, artificially intensified by the propaganda pressure of the National Socialists, who blamed the Reichstag fire on a revolutionary communist plot, raising the alarm of an imminent communist revolutionary attempt. He was, as I said, particularly sensitive to this siren call for stability and the preservation of order.
Perhaps there was an unspoken deal, an unwritten exchange, the Zentrum's vote in return for the Reich signing a concordat with the Catholic Church.
In terms of documents, we do not have indisputable evidence that a specific proposal was made to Ludwig Kaas by Hitler or by Göring, who was the president of the parliament, a clear quid pro quo along the lines of, you give us your vote and we give you the concordat. Some witnesses mention this, and there are some indirect sources, but these are not likely 100% reliable. It is very likely that some promises were made, but the fact remains that no written letter ever surfaced to confirm or solidify this arrangement. Let us not forget that Catholics were the majority in some important regions, and still are today, like Bavaria, Baden, and Württemberg. They had long demanded, in vain, an agreement between the German state and the Vatican, a concordat. Let us also not forget that the Zentrum had been part of the government of the Republic since 1918, but had never managed to secure such an agreement with the Vatican, largely because of the opposition of the Prussian German ruling class, which was predominantly Protestant. At this point, the glimmer of hope that seemed to open up for Ludwig Kaas, for German Catholics, and even for the ecclesiastical hierarchy, was the possibility of a concordat with the state, a formal agreement that would finally consolidate and guarantee the position of Catholics, the role of Catholic institutions, and the status of the Catholic Church hierarchy in Germany. Well, this opportunity was enormously important, and it was likely a key factor that led the leadership of the Zentrum to cast their votes in favor of that decree. A decision that ultimately proved to be fatal, absolutely devastating for the Republican institutions.
The Concordat gets signed in Rome in July 1933. But Hitler never honors it. A few months later, the Zentrum Party is disbanded. The persecution of Catholics intensifies. and Ludwig Kaas flees to avoid deportation to a concentration camp. He finds refuge in the only place willing to shelter him, the Vatican. And yet Eugenio Pacelli, who knows that man well, and knows that mistake even better, never turns his back on him. He welcomes him. He defends him. He doesn't just see the politician. He sees a man who pays dearly for a wrong decision. Perhaps, and this is only a guess, he even sees a reflection of himself. He gives him the most delicate of missions, to lead the excavations in search of the tomb of St. Peter. Kaas isn't a trained archaeologist, but Pacelli doesn't seem to mind. The logic is simple. Better a handful of loyal men than a crowd of experts who might be impossible to control. Joining the dig are Professor Enrico Yossi and two Jesuits, Father Antonio Ferrua and Father Engelbert Kirschbaum. None of them has real experience with archaeological excavation. Their crude methods risk damaging the relics and even the foundations of St. Peter's Basilica. But their enthusiasm runs so high, you see them there, digging and prying floor tiles loose beneath the main altar, like prospectors in search of gold. They immediately uncover mausoleums, sarcophagi, mosaics, an entire necropolis. Next, a series of altars, nested like Russian dolls. The topmost is the altar where solemn Mass is celebrated in the Basilica. Beneath it, a Gregorian altar. Lower still, one dating back to the time of Constantine. It's this last one that encloses the shrine believed to have been built directly over Peter's tomb. Pius XII probably feels his heart skip a beat as the team digs and digs until they reach the tomb, and it's empty. The Pope won't accept it. He's convinced the apostles' remains must be hidden somewhere. And he's right, because not long after, they unearth bones. But let's pause for a moment, because while Kaas is overseeing the excavation, and in fact uncovers bones, which we'll return to shortly, something else is unfolding in the shadowy labyrinths of the necropolis. Encounters that feel straight out of a spy thriller. Except this isn't just a story. According to historian Mark Rebling, who reconstructs this episode in his book, Church of Spies, back in 1940, Ludwig Kaas begins meeting again and again with a man named Joseph Müller, a German lawyer and anti-Nazi. In truth, a conspirator and a spy. Their goal, to assassinate Adolf Hitler and negotiate peace with the Allies. Müller, by then, has already been working inside Pacelli's spy network for several years. He operates from his law office, gathering evidence of Nazi abuses against both clergy and lay members of the Catholic Church, and quietly relaying that information to Pacelli through indirect channels. And when Pacelli becomes Pope, Wilhelm Canaris, the head of German military intelligence, along with his deputy Hanso Storr, both aware of Müller's ties to the new Pontiff, draw him into a fateful conspiracy. The plan unfolds in 3 acts. First, assassinate Hitler by any means necessary. Second, stage a coup in Germany, quell the civil war that would likely follow, and install an anti-Nazi military junta. Third, negotiate an honorable peace with the United Kingdom and its allies, and restore democracy in Berlin. That peace, however, must be brokered before the assassination, to prevent the British from exploiting the upheaval at Germany's expense, and to convince them that the future government, unlike Hitler, will be a trustworthy counterpart. Only the Vatican can conduct a negotiation of this kind. It is the only state maintaining diplomatic ties and communication channels with all the warring nations. Canaris and Oster recruit the lawyer Müller into the Nazi intelligence service, tasking him with posing as a conspirator to identify enemies of Nazism in Italy. In truth, he is an anti-Nazi posing as a Nazi pretending to be an anti-Nazi. Muller arrives in Rome to secure the cooperation of Pius XII. Unable to approach Pacelli directly, Muller uses his regular contact, Ludwig Kaas, who acts as a go-between in this deadly dance. Their meetings take place in the necropolis beneath St. Peter's Basilica, where excavations are underway to locate the remains of the first apostle. The site thus becomes the stage for secret meetings, tentative deals, and desperate hopes of halting Nazi madness. Muller outlines his plan to assassinate Hitler to Kaas, and Kaas in turn relays it to Pacelli. The Pope takes a day to consider it. On the one hand, there is little doubt that killing a person, even Adolf Hitler, is a sin. On the other, the theological school of Salamanca, and especially Jesuit thinkers like Juan de Mariana and Martin Anton del Rio, had already argued in the 1500s that killing a tyrant could be consistent with Christian doctrine when no other options remained. Del Rio even wrote that, in extreme cases, one must
make a libation to God with the king's blood.
But, spoiler alert, Hitler will never be killed. The plot will fail. The war will rage on in all its horror until the very end. And Riccardo Galeazzi-Lisi? There's no sign he ever knew about the plan, or maybe he simply never wanted to say. His duty lay elsewhere, to handle the bones of St. Peter and the curse bound to them. We are in
a secluded corner of the Vatican City,
as Galeazzi-Lisi himself describes it. It's been transformed into a secret lab. Tesla coils hang from the ceiling. A microscope sits on a table cluttered with bone fragments, vials, beakers, and jars filled with formaldehyde. In the background, a generator hisses and flashes with a sinister glow. And in the middle of it all, there's Riccardo. White lab coat on. An ophthalmologist, yes. A homeopath, too. And now, by all accounts, an amateur archaeoanthropologist. This is how a long process of reconstruction begins. A jigsaw puzzle. You take a box full of scattered pieces and try to reassemble the picture on the lid, the one showing you what it's meant to become. The box Ludwig Kaas handed him, containing bones recovered during the excavation and thought to be those of St. Peter, had no picture on the lid. But Riccardo, true to his motto, remis evidis, by oar and by sail, presses on. At a museum of anatomy, he finds a life-size photograph of the skeleton of an adult male of average stature. He places it on the operating table as a guide. This marks the beginning of the most thrilling and dangerous puzzle in the entire history of Christianity. With trembling hands, he lifts the bones from the urn, perhaps the very ones Pope Gregory the Great once said, "No one should even dare look upon." He examines them one by one. He notices that after so many centuries underground, they begin to crumble quickly when exposed to the air. He then finds a special varnish and coats each bone before fitting them into place. When a section starts to take shape, based on the photograph, he ties the fragments together with wire. This is no ordinary puzzle. Riccardo must identify semi-fossilized bones, place them in the correct anatomical order, distinguish between left and right, varnish each one, and fix it carefully in place with wire. He starts with the tiny wrist bones, then moves on to the phalanges, metacarpals, humari, radii, ulnae, and scapulae. The clavicles are joined to the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar vertebrae, continuing down to the pelvis, femurs, and knees. Piece by piece, until every fragment of more than 200 bones that make up a human body finds its place. How much stubborn perseverance does it take for a homeopathic ophthalmologist, armed only with his limited university knowledge of anatomy and orthopedics, to complete such a task? A task that may well be forbidden, perhaps even cursed or sacrilegious. One that risks bringing misfortune upon his head. And sure enough, that misfortune does come. But Riccardo succeeds. He completes the work, and in the end, he writes that the skeleton
Was missing only the skull and a few of the smaller bones.
On a cold, gray February morning, Riccardo and the other members of a specially appointed scientific commission shut the doors of St. John Lateran behind them and climb up to the ciborium, the canopy-like structure above the altar. They reach the silver reliquary shaped like Peter's bust. They pry off the golden face that serves as its lid, something no one had dared to do for centuries. Riccardo, now well accustomed to handling early Christian remains, removes the fragments of the skull without flinching, while the other commissioners watch in silent, trembling awe. Unfortunately, we will never know exactly how Riccardo conducted his analysis, because, as he himself writes,
I am not at liberty to disclose the details of these meticulous identifications and the conclusions drawn from them, due to strict confidentiality.
Nevertheless, Riccardo has no doubt.
I unequivocally established that the bones belonged to a single elderly man. My long task was complete. All that remained was the work of theologians and historians. For my part, I am certain I have seen and touched the mortal remains of St. Peter. I am sure that the skeleton I reconstructed with care and reverence is the body of Cephas, the man to whom the Lord entrusted a mission of evangelizing the Latin world, and who was martyred under Nero.
The decapitated skeleton, which Riccardo has pieced together during countless late-night vigils in his secret laboratory, will soon be handed over to a real anthropologist, Professor Venerando Carenti from the University of Palermo. According to Carenti, the remains will turn out to come from 6 different sources. 2 men in their 50s, one stocky, the other gaunt, a woman between 70 and 75, a rooster, a horse, and a pig. Before long, a young scholar with the ferocity of a martyr and a will of iron will burst onto the scene at the excavations beneath St. Peter's Basilica. Margherita Garducci, from Florence, a future legend of world archaeology. She will gradually, but decisively, take charge of the dig and devote her entire life to criticizing Kaz, Yossi, Farua, and Kirschbaum, whose incompetence, in her eyes, is beyond pardon. Riccardo Galeazzi-Lisi, on the other hand, will receive only a few merciless judgments in Garducci's writings, fleeting glimpses into a chasm of disgust.
It's not hard to imagine what I could say about Galeazzi-Lisi, and what I choose not to. There's no need to dwell on the inspection of the Lateran reliquaries carried out by Riccardo Galeazzi-Lisi.
And so on. Margherita Garducci's scornful air of superiority shows just how childish and biased Riccardo Galeazzi-Lisi's methods were. Anyone can see that laying out bone fragments over a photo of an elderly man isn't just unscientific. It's an operation rooted in bias. And that bias, inevitably, leads to the predictable conclusion that, what a surprise, the remains belong to an elderly man. A male. Just like the one in the photo. Even though they're really nothing more than a bunch of chicken bones and garbage. But the truth is something else. Listen closely.
In a sense, the study conducted, taking into account the anthropological studies of the 1930s and 40s, was performed correctly.
That's according to Dr. Edgard Camaros. He's a specialist in osteoarchaeology at the University of Cambridge, the top-ranked university in the world for this field, according to leading academic rankings. I showed him the pages from Riccardo's book about St. Peter.
At that time, physical anthropology, as they called what we call today, biological anthropology, used infinity of comparative biometrical measurements. Craniometry is an example of it.
Just like the ones used by Riccardo. And there's more. Professor Megan Wetherill, a paleontology professor at the University of Arizona, the second-ranked institution in the world for this field, agrees.
Riccardo appears very vague in his descriptions of how the bones were analyzed and repaired, but that does not seem entirely out of sorts with how paleontological material was discussed in the 1940s and 50s.
All standard, then?
Having looked at specimens that were repaired during that time period, they used varnishes, epoxy, and often plaster to restore specimens. Frequently, the plaster was painted so well that it is hard to recognize it is not genuine bone. Similarly, bones being attached with brass wire is something I see a lot of in collections from that period.
However, the study conducted used a referential base in a very basic manner. It is therefore basic and not modern for the time, but physical anthropology was developed in many ways and in different stages in the mid-20th century.
Radiocarbon dating was invented in the 1940s, but I do not think it was common until the 1970s or so. With paleontology, it is genuinely hard to tell bone age if it does not belong to an animal like a mammoth, or if you have radiocarbon dates, or if it is an animal that died alongside a mammoth, then it becomes a bit easier.
What a challenge. There were no mammoths in the Vatican.
He could have explained what features he used to determine the sex. How does he know it was a male individual? Masculine features spotted? Robusticity? Nowadays, a more exhaustive, standardized approach would have been necessary, including a pathological assessment.
Even in the 1940s, a bit more rigor with descriptions would have been expected. What type of varnish? How many bones? Were they found connected? What position was he lying in? Etc. An archaeologist would have more to critique on that front, I suspect.
In the end, it is a basic methodology, even for the time, but not a wrong approach to the osteological assemblage.
One might poke fun at the work of the ophthalmologist-archaeologist homeopath, with a touch of good-natured irony, or, more sharply, with the merciless barbs that Carducci once directed his way. But the truth is that Riccardo did his duty. He did it within the limits of his abilities, yet with methods that, all things considered, were reasonably in line with the standards of his time. And, until now, no one has ever bothered to say so. In a Christmas radio message, many years later, Pius XII would go on to announce to all Catholics around the world that the answer to the question,
"Was it truly the case that the tomb of St. Peter was found?"
was
a perfectly clear yes.
Other elements, later analyzed by Carducci herself, would in fact suggest that the tomb discovered did indeed belong to Peter. But, when it came to the question of whether the relics of the saint had actually been found, the answer was a very clear, probably not. In fact,
human bones were found at the edge of the tomb. But it is not possible to prove with certainty that they belong to the mortal remains of the apostle. That does not, however, take away from the historical reality of the tomb. The great dome rises directly above the burial site of the first bishop of Rome, the first pope.
That should be enough for the skeptics.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt this broadcast and take you now to Washington.
The war is raging. In June 1941, Hitler launches an attack on the Soviet Union. In December, Mussolini formally declares war on the United States of America. The prevailing certainty is still that the final victory will belong to the Axis, and the Vatican, surrounded and threatened by the fascist regime, has placed its bets on that outcome. There will be suffering, of course, but victory is seen as inevitable. In 1942, Allied bombs rain down on Milan and Genoa, but Rome remains untouched. It is sacred. Standing as its symbolic shield is Eugenio Pacelli, the Pope, whom the people have begun to jokingly call Rome's anti-aircraft defense. Bombs fall on Naples, Messina, Turin, and many other cities, but not on the Eternal City. In 1942, Riccardo reaches another major professional milestone. He becomes head of ophthalmology at the Fate Benefratelli Hospital on Tiber Island in Rome, a hospital that, before long, will offer refuge to several persecuted Jews, and that will hide a radio transmitter used for communication between Allied soldiers and partisans. According to Professor Pierluigi Guiducci, a jurist and historian, the fact that Galeazzi-Lisi was working at Fate Benefratelli is proof that Pius XII knew about the Jewish families being sheltered there, and that the Pope supported those secret rescue operations. After all, what else could he have done? Report the entire hospital to the fascist police, including his own personal physician? Riccardo also moves into a new home on Jasmine Hill, a hidden and precious corner of Rome. Almost a secret refuge tucked behind the Vatican Hill. From there, the view opens onto a stunning valley. In summer, it bursts with colors and scents. The horizon is ruled by the solemn majesty of St. Peter's great dome. It is a place of peace and beauty. And from there, Riccardo often makes his way down to visit his most important patient. Eugenio, once imposing, proud, and authoritative, is now a shadow of his former self, worn down by physical decline, tormented by a workload he himself imposed on the Vatican's bureaucratic machine, and devastated by depression, by a growing psychosomatic anguish. The deep lines carved into his face tell the story of a man whose humanity is slowly crumbling under the crushing weight of history. In February 1943, everything changes. After months of heroic, desperate, and bloody fighting, Stalingrad does not fall to the Nazis. It is Stalingrad that breaks them. The Russians push the Nazi-fascist armies back. It is a decisive and humiliating defeat for the Führer and the Duce. It is the turning point. Pacelli begins to realize that the Axis might lose the war, and he anxiously wonders what will become of the church he was forced to align. The wind begins to shift, and it carries a deeply threatening force. In July 1943, the Allies land in Sicily. Not in Sardinia, as the Italian and German strategists had expected. From that moment on, the war is lost for Italy. But the King of Italy and Mussolini refused to admit it. 9 days later, July 19, 1943, Rome is about to live through its longest day. At dawn, at the American 97th Bombardment Group base, Colonel Hamilton Jobson briefs the pilots with a stern warning.
We are to hit only the assigned targets. If anyone drops by mistake on the Vatican or the Colosseum, well, they'd better not come back.
The chaplain, watching the troops depart, blurts out,
"Boys, give them hell."
Last night, leaflets were dropped over Rome. They warned the population that a bombing would take place today, and they urged people to flee. But no one believes it. It sounds like a trick, just a way to spread fear. After all, who could be barbaric enough to bomb the Eternal City, the cradle of Christianity and civilization, glorious, untouchable Rome? The air raid siren echoes through the Roman neighborhood of San Lorenzo, over the university citadel of La Sapienza, over the railway yard, over the Basilica, beneath which lie, among others, St. Lawrence himself, over the Air Force headquarters, over the Verano Cemetery, over the barbershops, the taverns, and the homes, including the one on Corso Trieste, where Professor Galeazzi-Lisi lived until not long ago. A light breeze still carries a few of the leaflets through the air.
Romans! Leave your homes if they're near train stations, airfields, or military barracks. Do not believe Mussolini's propaganda. See you soon!
The 301st Group of the United States 12th Air Force takes off from the Saharan base of Benghazi in Libya and joins the fighter planes coming from Tunisia. One of the B-24s bears the name Delta Rebel 2 painted on its side. Among the crew is Clark Gable, Rhett Butler from Gone with the Wind, and already an Academy Award winner for Best Actor in It Happened One Night. A man who embodies glamour, luxury, and seduction. Now, in the brutal reality of war, he is about to bomb the city of beauty, art, and civilization. Hollywood is about to meet the apocalypse. Another bomber, the B-17 Flying Fortress No. 43 FIVO 1, is called Lucky Lady. It is the flight leader, the aircraft assigned to drop the first bombs on Rome in its entire millennia-old history. At this very moment, Benito Mussolini is in Feltre, deep in northern Italy, holed up in a villa with Adolf Hitler. He's been sitting through hours of one of the Führer's wild, theatrical chewing-outs about the Allied landing in Sicily. The Lucky Lady is flying over Rome at 360 kilometers per hour. It passes undisturbed above St. Peter's Basilica, Castel Sant'Angelo, and all the houses, streets, churches, and shops that lie between those two landmarks and the freight yard of San Lorenzo. At exactly 11 o'clock, it reaches its target, 6 kilometers below. The Norden bomb site, an electronic device and a closely guarded secret of the U.S. Air Force, starts to pulse beneath the eyes of Bombardier Lieutenant Owen Gibson, a 23-year-old supermarket clerk from Colorado. The lieutenant presses the red button. The bomb bays open. The bombs, each packed with half a ton of TNT and aluminum powder, begin their fall. At 1,000 meters from the ground, the whistling tears through the air, shattering windows and storefronts for hundreds of meters around. Before impact, the blast trips trees, flips a vendor's stall, and throws people to the ground with a deafening roar. A 30-meter fireball engulfs the railway station. A column of black smoke rises into the sky. The wind spreads the smoke. The other bombers lose visibility. Instead of hitting precise targets, drop their bombs blindly. A cluster of bombs crashes down on a building in Via dei Volsci, burying all the guests at a wedding celebration. Another hits the clinical medicine building, the Institute of Hygiene, and the orthopedics ward, incinerating patients and medical staff. Other bombs rip through an orphanage and the juvenile prison, where the guards had already fled, leaving the boys locked in their cells, screaming for mercy. The bombs strike the Verano Cemetery in 3 separate places. They shake the ground and the bones, scattering hundreds of bodies inside and outside the cemetery walls. Bombs fall on both sides of the Pacelli family mausoleum, and yet it remains miraculously untouched. Riccardo Galeazzi-Lisi is in his clinic on Via Sistina when the ground begins to shake and the sky turns dark. He understands immediately. He has to run to the Pope. He fears he'll find him buried under the rubble. When he arrives, he sees Eugenio Pacelli in tears, stuffing cash into the pockets of his cassock. Not to flee, but to bring it personally to the victims of the bombing.
They bombed Rome. They had no right.
A black Mercedes-Benz carrying Pius XII leaves the Vatican and heads toward the bombed-out neighborhoods. It's followed by a Fiat 1500 with Riccardo and his brother Enrico Pietro on board. Rome has become a city of ghosts, cloaked in dust and the eerie silence of the survivors. At Porta Maggiore, the scene is apocalyptic. A crowd of ash-covered figures, homeless, hopeless, gathers around the cars. They reach out their hands, cry out for help, and search for the Pope, Rome's anti-aircraft shield, the umbrella that was meant to protect them, and instead proved powerless. Eugenio steps out of the car. He kneels among the rubble. A worker, covered in dust and blood, offers him his jacket so he won't have to kneel on broken glass. In a silence broken only by sobs, the Pope lifts his eyes to the sky and prays.
Lord, hear our voice. have mercy on us.
His robes are stained with blood. Blood from someone who tried to cling to him. And the tears of those watching him pray begin to flow. Riccardo is beside him, as always, like no one else. The only one ready to hold him up, to protect him from the hands of the crowd, from the psychological collapse that is overwhelming him. Riccardo helps Eugenio back into the car. He takes him home, to the Vatican. The cars inch forward, tugged at by the desperate crowd. Behind them, the neighborhood is a sea of fire and rubble. In that terrible moment, Riccardo and Eugenio find themselves side by side, like brothers in the storm. The pain they share, the fear they carry, the ache of trying to console a broken people, these bind them in ways no words ever could. That day, among the ruins and the cries, their bond becomes unbreakable. 6 days later, Mussolini will be deposed and arrested, but the bombs will not stop falling. In August, the Allies will strike again, and the people, each time, will wait for the arrival of Pius XII as one waits for a miracle. Instead, it will be the Nazis who arrive, occupying Rome. And in Hitler's hands, an unthinkable plan is already in motion, to kidnap Pope Pacelli, deport him to Germany, and erase the Vatican from history forever. Besieged behind the ancient walls, Eugenio and Riccardo wait, hearts pounding. Bound by fear, worn down by exhaustion, by the weight of secrets and responsibility, the two men are now inseparably linked. Together, they will pass through the deepest darkness, holding each other up in an extreme test of loyalty and courage. Their battle is only just beginning, and the worst, perhaps, is yet to come.
You've just listened to the third episode of Riccardo, The Man Who Blew Up the Pope, a podcast by Rob Ferraro. Produced in association with WWII.